In this presentation, we are looking at the implication of our system of 5 moral principles to this troubling practical and theoretical question as to whether the ends justify the means. Think first about the principle of beneficence. As I've suggested, it points to the obligation we have to do things that are inherently helpful, that by their very nature make people better off, but also it requires us to attend to and take responsibility for the full consequences of our actions. That represents an affirmation, I think, of the moral relevance of the consequences of our actions. However, the other principles, non-maleficence, autonomy, justice, fidelity, identify inherent features of actions that are also morally relevant. At the end of the last presentation, I suggested that ours is a moderate deontological approach. It's moderate because it does consider consequences to be relevant. Beneficence requires us to do that. But, unlike a purely consequentialist theory, it does not reject the idea, in fact, it affirms the idea, that inherent features of actions are also morally relevant. So, obviously, all the actions depicted here involve something seriously morally problematic. They are all actions that are inherently harmful. And from the perspective of our principles, that is morally relevant, independent of whatever long-term consequences those actions might have. Similarly, the beneficial actions depicted here are morally appropriate because they are inherently helpful to other human beings. Similarly, any action that is inherently coercive or manipulative is wrong, or at least seriously morally problematic, independent of whatever consequences might be produced by that coercion or manipulation. Any action that is inherently unjust, violating human dignity, is wrong or seriously morally problematic. Again, independent of whatever good consequences such an action might produce. An action that fails to live up to another's legitimate expectations of us based upon promises we have made, commitments we have made, or roles that we are playing, such an action is wrong, or at least seriously morally problematic, again, independent of its consequences. However, because the principle of beneficence also requires us to attend to the consequences of our actions, the ends sometimes may justify the means. But of course, not always, depending on how serious and profound the violation of the inherent features identified by our other principles actually is. Let me suggest the following, what I would regard as common sense proposal about how to think about situations in which we are tempted to believe that good ends justifies morally problematic means. We must ask ourselves 4 questions. First, how good, how morally compelling is the end sought? Obviously, if the end sought is the avoidance of some profound tragedy, like the death of hundreds of innocent people, that's a morally compelling end, and we may well be in a situation where that end justifies the means. However, to use an example at the other end of the spectrum, simply to pass your ethics test, that probably is not a morally compelling end, and therefore, obviously, cheating to do that is unjustified. The second thing to ask ourselves is whether or not the questionable means is necessary to the achievement of some morally compelling end. Is it truly a last resort? Or is there some other way, not so seriously morally problematic, not violating one of our moral principles, through which we might, in fact, achieve that good end? Next, how probable is the good end as a result of the questionable mean? That is to say, are we truly confident that we can produce the end that compels us morally through the action that we are contemplating? Or is it merely speculative or hopeful or even wishful thinking that we may be able to achieve that good end through this morally questionable means? And then finally, and most difficult of all, how profound is the violation represented by the questionable means that we are considering? Are there some acts that are simply so awful that we may never do them, even if they seem necessary to some compelling moral end? In class, we will look at a couple of scenarios to which this question of ends and means applies. But I want you to think now about this one. It's a famous scenario called the sheriff's dilemma. A sheriff has in his custody a man thought to be guilty of a heinous crime, but in the process of arresting him, the sheriff discovers evidence that verifies his innocence. He's holding the prisoner until Monday morning, let's say, when he'll be taken before a court and his case will be thrown out. In the meantime, the sheriff's office, the prison, is surrounded by a lynch mob that is threatening to burn down an orphanage unless the sheriff releases this prisoner, who they don't realize is innocent, into their murderous hands. The question is this: should the sheriff release that prisoner? Now, the good end would be saving the lives of those innocent orphans. The questionable means would be releasing an innocent prisoner to a lynch mob, in violation both of his duties as a sheriff to serve justice and the law, a violation of fidelity, and also, obviously, a harmful act that violates non-maleficence. So these are the questions I would suggest we need to ask ourselves in trying to decide what the sheriff should do. How good, how morally compelling is the end sought? The saving of the lives of 100 innocent children. Probably pretty compelling. Is the questionable means necessary? That is to say, is there any other action, any other path available to the sheriff whereby he might save those innocent children? If he is to actually release the prisoner, how likely or how probable is it that he will successfully save those innocent children? Or will the lynch mob discover the great joy they find in terrorizing and killing? And if it were to succeed, we still might ask, how profound is the violation represented by that questionable mean? Is a sheriff releasing an innocent prisoner to a lynch mob so awful that even if it saved the lives of 100 children, it would be wrong? My suggestion is we all need to think about our answers to those questions in deciding whether in a case like this, the ends do in fact justify the means. As I've suggested, in class we will be looking at other scenarios, particularly scenarios drawn from the context of healthcare.